What kind of world believes that death is not the end, but a journey so dangerous, so sacred, and so mysterious that the body itself must be transformed to survive it? Tonight, we travel back into the ancient sands of Egypt, into a civilization that spent thousands of years perfecting the art of preserving the dead, protecting the soul, and preparing for eternity. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy slow, immersive storytelling, designed to help you relax, unwind, and drift gently to sleep, be sure to subscribe for more. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind grow quiet as we begin tonight's story of mummification and burial rituals. Before there were pyramids, before there were painted coffins, before the dead were wrapped in layer after layer of linen and sealed behind spells, there was only the desert, the body, and the stubborn Egyptian refusal to believe that a human life should simply vanish. The story of mummification does not begin in a dark, embalming workshop with polished metal hooks and jars guarded by divine sons of Horus. It begins in much quieter places, in shallow graves scooped into the hot sand of pre-dynastic Egypt, where the dead were laid on their sides in a fetal pose, wrapped in reed matting or skin, surrounded by a few pots, beads, pallets, and tools, and given back to the earth at the edge of the Nile Valley. The sand, dry and merciless, did something strange. It did not always devour, sometimes it preserved. In many of those early burials, the heat and dryness drew moisture from the corpse so quickly that the body endured. Hair remained, skin held, fingernails lasted. The dead did not disappear as completely as one might expect. It is one of the great quiet revolutions in religious history. The landscape itself may have taught the Egyptians that the body could survive death, and from that possibility grew one of the most elaborate mortuary traditions in human civilization. That early preservation mattered because Egyptian religion was never built on the idea that the self could flourish while the body was irrelevant. The dead needed continuity. What endured after death was not imagined as a simple ghost floating free forever in abstraction. Egyptian thought divided personhood into multiple interlocking elements. The body remained crucial. The car, often described as a life force, needed sustenance. The BA, that mobile, personality-bearing aspect often shown as a human-headed bird, could move between worlds. The Ak represented a transformed and effective blessed state among the dead. These were not loose poetic metaphors. They were operational parts of existence. To survive, a person had to remain integrated. One reason tombs were stocked with food, furniture, cosmetics, linens, tools, and images was not mere sentimentality. The dead were expected to continue in some form of recognizable life. In Egypt, eternity was not a blank heaven, but often an idealized continuation of earthly order, renewed and purified. To preserve the body was to preserve the possibility of reunion, function, identity, memory, and return. In those earliest centuries, burial itself carried the weight. Later rituals would distribute among priests, texts, masks, and shrines. A grave was already a statement that the dead required care. Grave goods already implied that death was a passage rather than an erasure. pottery vessels containing food or drink, cosmetic palettes, amulets, and practical possessions all say the same thing across millennia. Someone expected the person beneath the sand to need these things. The dead were not cast away. They were provisioned. Even before the architecture of royal eternity appeared, the emotional and spiritual logic was in place. Burial was an act of relationship. The living arranged a final home. They marked a threshold. They sent supplies. They remembered. The ritual world of later Egypt did not emerge out of nothing. It expanded from these simple convictions until the entire civilization seemed organized around the problem of ensuring that no worthy dead person entered the next world, empty-handed or unprotected. As Egyptian society became more stratified and politically organized in the late pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, burials changed with it. Graves became more substantial. The dead were no longer always placed directly in the preserving embrace of open sand. Bodies began to be set in pits lined with mats, wood, or mud brick, and eventually enclosed within more formal funerary structures. That change created a problem. A body buried away from direct contact with dry desert sand decayed more easily. In protecting the dead more honorably, Egyptians also interrupted the natural process that had once preserved them. It is here, somewhere in the tension between reverence and decomposition, that artificial mummification begins to make sense. The Egyptians were not embalming bodies from a fascination with death alone. They were trying to recover, reproduce, and eventually improve upon what the desert had once done for free. For a long time, scholars assumed that true mummification did not begin until around the Old Kingdom, when more explicit evidence appears. Yet chemical analyses of very early wrappings and burial materials have pushed the origins of embalming knowledge deeper into prehistory. Studies of late Neolithic and pre-dynastic linen from Upper Egyptian burials found recipes involving plant oils, animal fats, conifer resin, aromatic plant extracts, and antibacterial agents. Another later study identified a pre-dynastic mummy treated with balms strikingly similar in principle to those of much later formal mummification. This does not mean a fully developed 18th dynasty embalming laboratory existed in 3700 BCE. It means that long before pyramids, Egyptians were already experimenting with preserving the dead using substances that slowed decay and sacralized the body. The process was not born all at once. It accumulated. It was discovered in fragments, in practice, in local knowledge, in rituals refined over centuries, until the body itself became a crafted sacred object. When kings began to rule a more unified Egypt, burial became inseparable from power. Tombs announced status as much as they managed death. Elite graves grew larger and richer. Retainer burials associated with some early dynastic royal tombs show a court still clustered around its ruler even in death. A chilling testimony to how deeply kingship reshaped funerary life. Yet within that hardening hierarchy, the basic Egyptian hope remained recognizable. Preservation meant continuity. Provision meant survival. Ritual meant safe passage. The dead ruler, no less than the village burial before him, required protection, food, identity, and a path onward. What changed was scale. Royal death became a national theological event. The king was no longer simply an ancestor. He was tied to cosmic order itself. His burial had to secure not only his personal future, but the balance of the world. By the Old Kingdom, tomb and mortuary cult had become integrated into the architecture of state and cosmos. Mastabas for elites and pyramids for kings did more than house bodies. They positioned the dead within a universe of offerings, priestly service, solar ascent, and divine transformation. The body still mattered, perhaps now more than ever, but it was increasingly one part of a grander mortuary system. False doors allowed offerings to pass symbolically between worlds. Serdabs held statues that could serve as substitute bodies or points of contact if the corpse was damaged. Chapel scenes depicted endless supplies of bread, beer, cattle, geese, linen, and incense, making image itself into eternal provision. If early desert burials taught Egypt that a body might endure, Old Kingdom funerary culture declared that endurance must be engineered, housed, fed, and ritually activated forever. And then came words. Some of the earliest major funerary texts in world history, the pyramid texts, were inscribed in royal pyramids beginning in the late Old Kingdom, first securely attested in the Pyramid of Unas. Their spells were not memoirs or eulogies. They were technologies of transition. They protected the dead king, equipped him, transformed him, and guided him through dangers into divine company. They reveal something profound about Egyptian burial from this early stage. The dead did not simply need preservation of flesh. They needed language. They needed spoken or inscribed force. They needed names remembered, identity stabilized, gates opened, enemies warded off, limbs reassembled, mouths restored, and cosmic routes mapped. Burial ritual was never just about preventing rot. It was about creating a person who could function after death. A preserved body without rites would be incomplete. A tomb without spells would be vulnerable. A corpse had to be made socially and spiritually alive again. This is why the Egyptian story of the dead cannot be reduced to, they believed in an afterlife. That phrase is too thin for what they built. They believed death introduced instability. The body could decay, the name could be erased, the heart could testify against its owner, spirits could be lost, hungry, voiceless, blind, or trapped. Tomb robbers could shatter continuity. Improper burial could produce danger for both dead and living. Against all of this, Egyptian funerary religion assembled a total response. Architecture, craft, liturgy, scent, wrapping, image, offerings, procession, lament, memory, and divine narrative. The dead were not merely buried, they were transformed. The corpse became a mummy, the tomb became a machine of eternity, and the funeral became an act of cosmic repair. At the heart of this transformation stood a myth that would shape Egyptian mortuary practice for thousands of years: the death and restoration of Osiris. In broad terms, Osiris was murdered, dismembered, and restored through the devotion of Isis and others, eventually becoming lord of the underworld and model for the resurrected dead. To embalm a body was, in part, to place it within that sacred pattern. The deceased could become an Osiris, identified with the god who had died and yet endured. Every wrapped limb, every resin-soaked bandage, every protective amulet, every funerary hymn participated in this larger theological drama. A funeral was not just a farewell, it was a reenactment of divine restoration. The dead person was not only remembered by family, he or she was inserted into the most powerful death and return story Egypt knew. Once the Egyptians had decided that the body must endure, preservation ceased to be accidental and became an art, a craft, a profession, and finally, a sacred discipline. The embalmers worked in spaces that were both practical and ritualized, places where chemistry, anatomy, liturgy, and theology met over the still form of the newly dead. To modernize, mummification can appear clinical, even macabre, but within ancient Egypt, it was not simply a matter of corpse treatment. It was deliberate remaking of the human being into a fit inhabitant of eternity. Each action carried symbolic force. Washing was purification, removal of vulnerable organs was protection, drying was stabilization, wrapping was both concealment and consecration. The body passed through a kind of ritual industry whose purpose was not merely to stop decay, but to convert mortality into a durable sacred form. Ancient literary descriptions, especially the account of Herodotus, long shaped popular ideas of how mummification worked. Modern archaeology and scientific analysis have complicated his testimony, but some broad points are confirmed. In the most elaborate form of embalming, the process took about 70 days. The body was first purified by washing. Internal organs liable to rapid decay were removed, usually through an incision in the left side of the abdomen. The heart was often left in place because it was associated with intelligence, memory, emotion, and moral identity, and would later play a decisive role in judgment. The brain, by contrast, was often extracted through the nose and discarded, though the details varied across period and place. The body was then dried using natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, before being anointed, packed, wrapped, and equipped. What sounds like a sequence of technical steps was also a sequence of ritual transitions. The dead person was being disassembled from earthly vulnerability and reassembled for another mode of existence. Natron was one of the great quiet substances of Egyptian civilization. Without it, mummification as we know it would have been impossible. This mineral salt drew moisture from the body and created the desiccated, stable form, on which later wrapping and ornament depended. Yet even here, the practical and symbolic cannot be neatly separated. Dryness meant resistance to corruption. Preservation meant victory over the dissolving forces associated with death and chaos. To dry the body was to arrest a slide into formlessness. The embalmers were not merely technicians preserving tissue. They were defenders of order against the unmaking tendencies of the grave. In a culture devoted to Ma'at, the principle of right order and balance, embalming became one more arena where order was reimposed on threat. A corpse left untreated was a body losing coherence. A mummy was a body reclaimed. The removed organs presented their own problem. They were part of the person, yet also sources of decay. In many periods, they were dried and placed in canopic containers, eventually associated with the four sons of Horus, each under the protection of a goddess. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were thus preserved under divine guardianship. In some later periods, embalmers changed practice and returned treated organs to the body while still providing symbolic canopic equipment in the tomb. This is one of the reasons Egyptian burial history must never be flattened into a single timeless formula. Practices evolved, workshops differed, regions varied. Even so, the underlying logic remained stable. Vulnerable parts of the person had to be guarded, transformed, and reintegrated into a protected funerary whole. The wrapping stage turned preservation into visibility, or perhaps into a carefully controlled invisibility. Linen strips and sheets, often treated with resins, were layered over the body in a process that could become highly elaborate. Bandaging held limbs in place, preserved shape, enclosed amulets, and created a new skin of ritual textile around the deceased. The resulting form was at once human and more than human. A mummy is unmistakably a body, and yet it is also an object, a relic, an icon, a sacred package of identity. The wrappings erased the ordinary nakedness of death and replaced it with crafted sanctity. In many cases, masks or cartonnage coverings gave the face an idealized permanence, not unlike a statement that the true self had been made fit to endure beyond the instability of flesh. Amulets nestled among these wrappings were not decorative extras. They were concentrated protections. Scarabs, eye symbols, djed pillars, knots of Isis, and other forms could be positioned at specific points on or within the mummy. Their placement activated a map of safety across the body. The famous heart scarab, for instance, could help prevent the heart from testifying against its owner at judgment. Other amulets stabilized limbs, invoked deities, or shielded vulnerable thresholds. The mummy was being armed. Bandage by bandage, charm by charm, it became a defended body. One might say that the Egyptians understood death not as a single door, but as a hazardous corridor. To travel it successfully required layers of insurance. The wrapped body was not passive. It was equipped. Those 70 days were not days of silence in any simple sense. Priests knew prayers for specific stages. Formulae were recited over substances and instruments. The embalmers themselves may have worked under ritual roles associated with divine prototypes, especially Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming and necropolis care. Even when practical skill dominated the room, practical skill operated within sacral speech. In Egyptian religion, words made things happen. To name, invoke, command, identify, or transform through speech was not symbolic theatre layered on top of reality. It was one of the ways reality was shaped. A body wrapped without proper recitation was not fully prepared. Material preservation and verbal activation belonged together. The dead needed both chemistry and incantation. The mummy that emerged at the end of this process was never intended to lie in isolation. It belonged within a larger environment of coffin texts, nesting shrines, tomb scenes, funerary papyri, and offerings. During the Middle Kingdom, the coffin texts expanded access to mortuary spells beyond the king, appearing on coffins used by wealthy, non-royal individuals. By the New Kingdom, the corpus modern scholars call the Book of the Dead developed into a flexible set of funerary compositions, often written on papyrus and placed with the deceased. These texts help the dead navigate dangers, identify deities, pass gates, transform into powerful forms, and emerge justified. Their growth reveals an important shift. Over time, forms of afterlife knowledge once concentrated around kings became more widely available, though still shaped by wealth and status. Mummification preserved the body. Funerary literature tutored the soul. The famous weighing of the heart belongs to this world of moral passage. In Egyptian judgment scenes, the heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Mayat. A balanced result allows entry into blessed existence under Osiris. Failure threatens annihilation or loss. This is one reason the heart remains so important in the mummy. It was not simply another organ. It was the moral witness, the inner record of a life. The Egyptian funeral therefore preserved not only anatomy, but accountability. To endure forever was not an automatic biological consequence of embalming. Preservation created the conditions for judgment and possible blessedness, but it did not erase ethical consequence. In that sense, the mummy is an arresting object. It is materially triumphant, beautifully preserved, and yet still awaiting a verdict. Social class shaped all of this. Not every Egyptian received the same elaborate treatment. Ancient sources describe cheaper and simpler methods, and archaeology confirms a range of quality and complexity in burials. Some bodies were splendidly wrapped and enclosed in multiple coffins. Others were far more modestly treated. Yet the dream of continuity extended beyond the elite. Even poorer burials show efforts at care, identity, and provision. Over long periods, afterlife expectations broadened. The democratization of the afterlife, though an imperfect phrase, points to the way non-royal people increasingly accessed funerary texts, iconography, and protective devices once associated with higher ranks. Egyptian burial remained unequal, but it was never spiritually empty for ordinary people. Rich and poor alike faced the same great danger of being forgotten, unprovided for, or unmade by death. To understand why mummification endured for millennia, one must appreciate how emotionally persuasive it was. It offered the living something to do. Death, which elsewhere might be an abrupt surrender, became a long labor of care. Family, priests, craftsmen, mourners, and officials all participated. The body was washed, dried, perfumed, swathed, adorned, named, lamented, and conveyed. Grief acquired procedure, love acquired ritual, status acquired display, theology acquired visible proof, and at the center of it all, the dead person remained strangely present. Not alive, not absent, but preserved in a state that invited continuing relationship. Tomb visits, offerings, commemorative cults, prayers and festivals all depended on this sense that the deceased still existed in some meaningful proximity to the world of the living. Mummification did not sever the relationship between living and dead. It formalized and extended it. By the time one stands before a finished Egyptian mummy, one is looking at a victory that is also an argument. It argues that the body matters. It argues that death can be resisted through knowledge. It argues that proper ritual can stabilize personhood. It argues that divine order can be extended into the grave. Its dried form, its layered wrappings, its amulets and inscriptions all testify to the same confidence. A human being need not be left defenseless before decay. That confidence was never total. Tombs were robbed, bodies were damaged, dynasties collapsed. Yet for more than 3,000 years, the Egyptians returned again and again to this astonishing labor of preservation, because it answered the deepest fear with the most tangible reply. Here, they said through resin, linen, natron, and prayer, is the beloved made ready to last. The Egyptian funeral did not end in the embalming place. In some ways, embalming only prepared the dead for the more public drama still to come. Burial was a procession through thresholds, an event in which family grief, priestly performance, social display, and sacred transformation all converged. The mummy had been made durable, but it had not yet been installed in eternity. That required movement from workshop to tomb, from private preservation to public rite, from corpse to ancestor, from one world to another. The funeral made this crossing visible. It gave shape to grief and turned transportation itself into theology. Every stage mattered because the dead were not thought to drift naturally into blessedness. They had to be escorted, announced, lamented, equipped, recognized, and ritually awakened. Funerary scenes in Tomb art preserve this movement in exquisite detail. We see the mummy on a sledge or funerary boat, attendants bearing furniture, offerings, vases, bouquets, and ritual tools, mourners with raised arms, priests in specific costumes, and processions moving across the desert edge toward the necropolis. Such scenes are not casual illustrations. They are idealized records of what had to happen and, in another sense, magical perpetuations of it. To depict the funeral was to keep it happening forever. If a real ritual had once taken place, the tomb image could renew its efficacy eternally. The Egyptians trusted image almost as much as object and word. What was represented correctly could continue to serve. So the funeral procession was both historical event and permanent liturgical resource. At the center of that procession stood grief, and Egyptian art does not hide it. Professional mourners could perform lamentation, often identified symbolically with Isis and Nephthys, mourning Osiris. Family members, especially women, appeared disheveled, beating their breasts, lifting their hands, or collapsing in stylized sorrow. Modern viewers sometimes assume such displays were theatrical in a dismissive sense, but ancient ritual rarely separates sincerity from form. Prescribed lament can intensify rather than diminish real emotion. In Egypt, mourning was not only personal pain, it was participation in sacred precedent. To mourn the dead was also to echo the divine mourning that made restoration possible for Osiris. Human grief and mythic grief flowed together. Tears were part of the machinery of resurrection. Offerings traveled with the dead because eternity required sustenance. Food, drink, oils, linens, furniture, jewelry, cosmetic equipment, walking sticks, headrests, and even games might accompany a burial, depending on wealth and period. Some of these were practical in the afterlife. Some were symbolic substitutes. Some expressed status. Some were transformed into perpetual provision through inscription and image. The dead needed bread and beer, because the dead were still imagined as beings with appetites and vulnerabilities. Even a splendid mummy would remain at risk if tomb cult failed and offerings ceased. This is why funerary endowments, mortuary priests, and tomb chapels mattered so much. Burial was not a one-day event, but the beginning of an ongoing relationship of care between living and dead. One of the most powerful rites performed near or at the tomb was the opening of the mouth ceremony. To modern ears, the name sounds cryptic, but its purpose was direct and profound: to restore the senses and capacities of the deceased so that he or she could breathe, eat, drink, speak, see, and hear again in the afterlife. Special instruments were touched to the mummy or to a funerary statue. The rite may have drawn on older ideas connected to animation, birth, statue consecration, and divine renewal. In effect, the dead person, preserved but inert, was being reactivated. A sealed body had to be made usable again. Without restored senses, what good were offerings, spells, or eternal fields of abundance. The ceremony did not claim to reverse biological death in an ordinary sense. It made the dead operational in the next world. This ceremony reveals the genius of Egyptian funerary thinking. They understood that preservation alone was not enough. One can imagine a perfectly preserved corpse that remains utterly useless to the self once housed within it. The Egyptians pushed beyond preservation toward functionality. The dead must see the sun, hear prayers, smell incense, taste offerings, and speak words of power. The body must be not only intact but enabled. In that sense, the funeral was less like a burial in the modern minimalist sense, and more like an installation and activation procedure. The mummy entered the tomb as something more than remains. It entered as a retooled, spiritually enabled person. The tomb itself was the setting where all these efforts converged. To call it a grave is true but inadequate. Egyptian tombs were interfaces between worlds. Their architecture varied enormously by period and class, from pit graves to mastabas, rock-cut chapels, pyramids, hidden valley tombs, and elaborate temple-linked mortuary complexes. But a common logic runs through them. There was a place for the body, a place for offerings, a place for image, and often a place for the living to approach. Decoration was never mere ornament. Agricultural scenes promised abundance. Banquet scenes promised pleasure and prestige. Offering lists multiplied provisions. Deities received and protected the dead. Texts guided, defended, and transformed. The tomb held not only a body, but a program for eternal existence. Royal tombs made this logic colossal. Pyramids and later royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings or elsewhere bound burial to cosmic geography. The king's afterlife involved solar rebirth, celestial ascent, underworld travel, and union with gods in forms articulated by changing theological traditions. Yet even there, the same basic anxieties persist. The king's name must endure. The body must be protected. The path must be known. Enemies in the next world must be overcome. Offerings must continue. What differs is the scale of resources committed and the density of ritual writing and imagery. The dead king's journey could be mapped across walls in compositions of astonishing complexity, but at heart, it still answered the same ancient question first asked in desert burials. How can a person continue after death without being lost? The role of statues within tombs is also telling. If the body were damaged, a statue might serve as another locus for the Kai. This backup logic reflects how vulnerable the dead remained despite every precaution. Egyptians knew tombs could be breached and bodies harmed. They therefore multiplied supports for identity. Name inscriptions preserved the self through writing. Images preserved the self through likeness. Statues preserved the self through substitute embodiment. Coffins nested one protective shell inside another. The funeral generated redundancy because eternity required insurance. The Egyptians did not trust a single point of failure. If body, image, name, text, offering, and ritual all reinforced one another, then the dead had a better chance of surviving catastrophe. When the mummy was finally placed within the coffin and the coffin within the tomb, the act was solemn, but not necessarily final in the emotional sense. Relatives could return. Offerings could continue. Festivals of the dead and cult observances could renew connection. Tomb chapels allow the living to stand before inscriptions and images, speak the name of the deceased, leave bread and beer, burn incense, and maintain the bond. This is one reason damnatio memoriae, the erasure of names and images, was so devastating in Egyptian terms. To destroy the signs through which a person remained accessible was to attack afterlife itself. Burial therefore depended as much on memory as on masonry. A forgotten dead person was endangered in a way no quantity of linen could fully remedy. The funeral feast too had meaning beyond social obligation. Some evidence suggests mortuary rituals concluded not only with grief, but with communal acts that affirmed continuity between living and dead. Death had taken a member of the community, but ritual placed that absence within a structure. The person was mourned, supplied, and repositioned. The community ate, spoke, remembered, and moved forward. The tomb became both endpoint and ongoing presence. It contained the dead, but it also radiated obligation back toward the living. To visit a tomb was to acknowledge that the social world extended beyond visible life. The dead still belonged. So the funeral procession across the desert edge was never only a journey to disposal. It was a carefully staged transfer from one condition of being to another. A body had been cleaned, dried, wrapped, and protected. Now it had to be introduced to eternity properly. It had to be wept over like Osiris, spoken for by priests, awakened by rite, enclosed in a house of images and spells, and set within a continuing economy of offerings and remembrance. Egyptian burial ritual was magnificent, not simply because it was elaborate, but because every object and gesture answered a recognizable human terror. What if the dead become voiceless, restore the mouth? What if they hunger, leave offerings? What if they are forgotten? Carve the name. What if the body fails? Preserve it. What if the way is dangerous? Write the spells. It is hard not to admire the tenderness hidden inside this complexity. The funeral was an argument made in grief. You shall not go into the dark unaccompanied. No account of Egyptian mummification is complete without the tomb, because the mummy was never meant to be understood apart from the space that received it. The tomb was not a neutral container. It was an engineered landscape of afterlife, an architecture built to continue the work begun by embalmers and priests. In some periods, it stood visible under the sun as a public marker of status and memory. In others, it was hidden in cliffs or sealed in desert valleys. But whether humble or monumental, the tomb existed to stabilize the dead. It held the body in safety, displayed the name, stored provisions, presented spells and scenes, and created a permanent place where living and dead could remain in relation. It was house, shrine, fortress, and theatre at once. For elites of the Old Kingdom, the mastaba established much of the classic non-royal tomb vocabulary. Its above-ground chapel and below-ground burial chamber linked two needs: concealment of the body and continued access for offerings. False doors allowed symbolic passage. Offering tables gathered the practical gestures of sustenance. Wall reliefs multiplied food and goods through representation. Servants, livestock, boats, workshops, and estates could be shown in such abundance that the tomb became a visual estate of eternity. The deceased was not merely buried beneath this structure. He or she was enthroned within a permanent economy of production. The wall image worked like a guarantee that labor and supply would not cease. It is one of the striking features of Egyptian mortuary imagination that they solved scarcity, not by denying appetite, but by picturing satisfaction endlessly. Royal pyramids brought another dimension, the fusion of burial with cosmic scale. Modern viewers often imagine pyramids primarily as monuments to royal ego, but from the Egyptian perspective, they were deeply theological forms. The king's burial chamber, mortuary temple, causeway, valley temple, and associated ritual spaces linked earth, horizon, and celestial destiny. The pyramid texts inscribed in some later pyramids did not simply decorate the walls. They acted upon the king's condition, protecting him, raising him, and integrating him with divine cycles. Royal burial was therefore not just a matter of protecting a corpse from decay. It was a matter of ensuring that kingship itself passed safely into transformed continuity. The dead king had to remain potent. His success mattered to the whole ordered world. As tombs evolved through the Middle and New Kingdoms, their decoration often became more intimate, varied, and texturally dense. Coffin interiors could carry spells. Papyrus rolls could accompany the body. Rock-cut tombs could open into decorated chapels, whose walls staged the life and ideal afterlife of the deceased. Agricultural scenes promised renewal. Marsh scenes suggested rebirth and pleasure. Journeys by boat echoed solar and funerary passage. Banquets displayed continuity of elite culture. Offerings piled high in registers, not because the dead were thought to become gross consumers, but because abundance itself signified safety, order, and divine favor. In a culture acutely aware of famine, disorder, and political fracture, the tomb's imagery asserts that the deceased has entered a realm where provision does not fail. The New Kingdom also expanded the visual and textual mapping of the underworld in spectacular ways, especially in royal contexts. Tomb walls could carry books of the night, books of gates, sun liturgies, and other compositions tracing the solar god's nocturnal journey and the dead king's participation in cycles of rebirth. Here, burial is no longer only static residence. It is motion through sacred time. The dead must traverse darkness, encounter gates and guardians, and emerge renewed with the morning sun. The tomb becomes less a resting place than a launch structure for repeated transformation. One can feel in these compositions a civilization refusing to let death harden into simple stillness. Even in burial, movement continues. The dead travel, transform, and return. For non-royal Egyptians, access to this complexity was shaped by means, but the same principles remained. A coffin painted with eyes allowed the deceased to look out symbolically. Texts on coffins spoke where the dead could not yet speak. Amulets within wrappings guarded the body. Texts without extended that guard into the tomb chamber and beyond. The famous shabtis, small funerary figures buried with many New Kingdom and later dead, were meant to answer in place of the deceased if labor were demanded in the afterlife. Their presence reveals something almost practical and tenderly human in Egyptian expectation. Eternity, however blessed, might still involve obligations, better to bring helpers. The afterlife was not imagined as abstract bliss. It was furnished with recognizable tasks, landscapes, and social needs. The tomb also guarded the boundary between memory and oblivion. Names mattered intensely. To speak the name of the dead was to sustain them. To erase it was to wound them. Tomb inscriptions therefore preserve genealogies, titles, achievements, and pious formulae, asking passers-by to offer recitations on behalf of the deceased. These appeals make ancient Egyptian burial feel startlingly immediate, Across millennia, the dead still ask the living for bread, beer, oxen, fowl, alabaster, linen, and everything good and pure on which a god lives. The formula is conventional, but the desire beneath it is not. The dead ask not to be abandoned. The tomb wall itself becomes a voice extending that plea into the future. Yet all this magnificence existed under threat. Tomb robbery was a chronic reality. Valuable goods attracted thieves. Political collapse weakened protections. Royal caches and reburials in later periods reveal how serious the danger became. Priests and officials sometimes moved mummies, especially royal ones, to hidden collective caches to protect them from looting. This development is poignant. Even the greatest kings, enclosed once in immense systems of stone and spell, could not rely forever on original tomb security. Their bodies had to be rescued, rewrapped, relocated, and concealed anew. Egyptian burial, for all its confidence, always lived under the shadow of violation. Perhaps this is another reason its rituals are so layered. The tomb was a fortress, not because the Egyptians were naive about danger, but because they knew it intimately. The relationship between tomb and landscape also mattered. Necropolises were not random cemeteries. They occupied the liminal edge between cultivated Nile life and the desert of the dead. West, where the sun set, became especially associated with burial and afterlife passage. To move into the necropolis was to move toward a charged horizon, where daily cosmic drama already suggested death and return. The setting sun vanished, but did not vanish forever. It entered night, travelled hidden, and rose again. Egyptian burial was profoundly shaped by such observation. The tomb's place in the desert was not only practical, it placed the dead within the geography of transformation. And within those tombs, art did what stone alone could not. It animated stillness. A sealed chamber might contain a body that no longer moved, but on the walls, servants harvested grain, fishermen cast nets, cattle were counted, women played lutes, priests offered incense, and gods extended protection. Egyptian funerary art is often called conservative, and in some formal senses it is. But emotionally, it is an extraordinary act of refusal. It refuses empty silence. It refuses blank walls. It refuses the idea that the dead should inhabit a void. Instead, it surrounds them with ordered life, ideal labor, proper ritual, and remembered beauty. The tomb does not deny death. It overwhelms death with structure. Seen this way, the Egyptian tomb is one of history's most ambitious answers to the problem of human mortality. It preserves a body, yes, but it also houses a program. Text to guide, images to feed, names to remember, spaces for offerings, and symbols of the cycles by which existence renews itself. A person laid inside such a structure was not merely hidden from decay. He or she was placed inside an argument that life, order, identity, and relationship could continue under divine protection. Stone, pigment, papyrus, linen, and ritual all joined the same claim. Death could wound, but with enough care, enough words, enough craft, and enough memory, it need not win everything. If mummification had remained a fixed custom, the story would be simpler, but less human. What makes Egyptian burial rituals so compelling is that they changed continually while preserving a recognizable core. Dynasties rose and fell. Foreign rulers entered Egypt. Theologies shifted emphasis. Economies strained and recovered. Workshops adopted regional habits. And through it all, Egyptians kept returning to the dead body as something to preserve, protect, and transform. The outer forms evolved. The inner fear remained. So too did the hope. To trace those changes is to watch a civilization think its way through mortality across more than 3,000 years. In the earliest periods, natural preservation and modest grave goods dominate. By the Old Kingdom, royal mortuary religion towers above the landscape in pyramid fields, and elite tombs systematize offerings and representation. The pyramid texts are royal, exclusive, and heavily focused on the king's transformation and ascent. Then, in the Middle Kingdom, afterlife access broadens in important ways. The coffin texts appear on non-royal coffins, extending protective and transformative spells beyond the king. This is not equality in any modern sense. Wealth still matters profoundly, but the older monopoly begins to loosen. More people can imagine themselves navigating the afterlife with textual support. This widening of ritual knowledge is one of the most significant developments in Egyptian burial history, because it shows that immortality was becoming more personalized and more socially dispersed. By the New Kingdom, the funerary culture familiar to many modern audiences reaches a particularly rich expression. The corpus, now known as the Book of the Dead, circulates in customizable papyrus copies placed with the deceased. Tombs in Western Thebes and elsewhere bloom with complex decoration. Coffins become increasingly anthropoid, visually identifying the enclosed dead with transfigured form. The cult of Osiris deepens the association between the deceased and the god who had himself been restored after violent death. Mummification methods become highly sophisticated, though still variable. It is also in this broad era that some of the most famous surviving burials, including that of Tutankhamun, display the extraordinary layering of coffin, shrine, mask, amulet, and ritual equipment that could surround an elite mummy. Burial becomes not simpler over time, but more densely expressive. Yet even within these grand traditions, there was no single rigid method. Recent scholarship emphasizes local variation in embalming recipes and practices. Workshops in different parts of Egypt may have used different combinations of oils, resins, waxes, and plant products. Some ancient literary accounts simplified or misunderstood what embalmers actually did. CT scanning and chemical analysis continue to revise our understanding. That matters for storytelling because it rescues the Egyptians from the false impression of timeless repetition. They experimented, they adapted, they guarded specialist knowledge. Mummification was a living practice, not a static museum label. The Egyptian dead were prepared by human communities responding to practical conditions, inherited formulas, local traditions, and changing religious tastes. Animal mummification reveals another expansion of funerary and votive logic. Humans were not the only beings wrapped and preserved. Cats, ibises, crocodiles, raptors, snakes, and many other animals were mummified in enormous numbers, especially in the first millennium BCE. Some were pets buried with owners. Some were food offerings for the dead. Many were votive offerings associated with temple cults and communication with specific deities. A smaller number were sacred animals treated as living manifestations of divine power. This multiplication of mummification beyond the human body shows how deeply preservation had become embedded in Egyptian religious imagination. Wrapping and preserving were no longer only answers to personal death. They were also acts of devotion, exchange, and divine mediation. Later periods brought new pressures and new syntheses. Under Libyan, Nubian, Sate, Persian, Greek, and Roman rule, Egyptian burial traditions did not disappear. They persisted, sometimes conservatively, sometimes creatively hybridized. The Ptolemaic and Roman periods are especially striking because traditional mummification could coexist with new artistic influences. In Roman Egypt, elite burials in places such as Hawara incorporated painted panel portraits placed over the mummy. These so-called Fayum portraits are among the most haunting survivals from antiquity. They present individuals in a style influenced by Greco-Roman painting while preserving the older Egyptian logic of wrapped burial and continued bodily care. The result is a cultural braid rather than a replacement. New visual language, old funerary purpose. These portraits remind us that burial ritual is one of the last places a culture abandons older convictions. Empires can conquer territory faster than they can dissolve the emotional habits around death. Even under foreign rule, many Egyptians and Egypt-based elites still wanted the body preserved, still wanted afterlife equipment, still wanted rituals that linked personhood to material continuity. Forms changed, but the old gravitational center remained. The dead still required care. They still needed a recognizable body. They still needed a place where memory could dwell. There is something deeply moving in that persistence. Long after kingdoms transformed, the Egyptian answer to mortality still whispered through linen and resin. At the same time, later mummies show shifts in emphasis. Decoration can become more externalized. Cartonnage and painted cases may dominate visual impact. Symbolic canopic equipment sometimes replaces functional organ storage. Embalming quality varies significantly. Economic realities and workshop choices leave visible marks. Some burials preserve astonishing luxury. Others display compressed or standardized forms. But such variation should not be mistaken for mere decline. It reflects adaptation. A civilization with a mortuary tradition spanning millennia cannot remain unchanged. What is remarkable is not that practices shifted, but that the central ambition survived at all: to hold the self together across death. Eventually, with the spread of Christianity in Egypt and the broader transformation of Mediterranean religious life, the ancient Egyptian mortuary system lost its cultural centrality. The old gods receded, temples closed, hieroglyphic literacy vanished. The theological networks that had sustained mummification for centuries thinned and broke. Yet the mummies remained. They endured in tombs, caches, ruined necropolies, museum cases, archaeological reports, and modern imagination. Ironically, the Egyptians succeeded so well in preserving their dead that later civilizations encountered them as almost uncomfortably present. A skull would have been easier to classify. A mummy confronts. It is a person-shaped remainder of a vanished worldview. Even now, to stand before one is to feel both the success and the poignancy of the ancient project. The body lasted. The ritual world around it did not last in the same way. Modern science has deepened that confrontation. CT scans reveal injuries, diseases, ages, and embalming techniques. Chemical analysis identifies balms and resins. Studies of prehistoric wrappings revise the timeline of early embalming. Museum ethics debates question the display of human remains. In this sense, Egyptian mummies continue to live a second history, one not of ancient afterlife, but of modern inquiry. Yet even this modern examination for all its analytical power, circles back to the same ancient human questions. Who was this person? Who loved them enough to preserve them? What did they fear? What future did they imagine? What does it mean that they still have a face? And that is perhaps the deepest truth about mummification and burial rituals in ancient Egypt. Beneath the gold masks and astonishing technical skill lies an emotion that has not changed. The Egyptians wanted their dead not to vanish. They wanted continuity where nature promised dissolution. They wanted identity to survive damage. They wanted memory to hold. They wanted the loved and the powerful and the ordinary to cross into another state without losing the thread of who they had been. So they built tombs, wrote spells, wrapped bodies, stored organs, painted names, brought offerings, restored mouths, guarded hearts, and imagined fields beyond judgment where the justified might live again. The history is accurate, the details are complex, the chronology stretches across millennia, but the pulse beneath it is simple. They loved the dead too much to leave them unmade by time. If the tomb was the last place the living could follow, the afterlife was where imagination, fear, and hope had to continue the journey alone. For the ancient Egyptians, burial did not guarantee peace any more than preservation guaranteed salvation. The mummy might be intact, the coffin painted, the amulet secured, the name written clearly, and the offerings laid in order, but beyond the sealed chamber, another passage still waited. This was the realm modern readers often call the underworld. Though the Egyptian vision was more layered than a simple kingdom of the dead, it was a place of gates, roads, ferries, guardians, darkness, judgment, and renewal. It was dangerous, but not meaningless. The dead did not wander there forever without purpose. They moved through it toward a hoped-for condition of blessed existence, provided they knew the way, survived the trials, and proved worthy before the gods. That is why funerary texts mattered so deeply. They were not decorative literature placed beside the dead out of reverence for words. They were a guidebook, a defense, a script, and a store of power for the road ahead. The ancient collection modern scholars call the Book of the Dead was more properly understood as spells for coming forth by day, a phrase that already reveals the emotional center of the Egyptian hope. Not endless burial, but emergence, restoration, and renewed presence in the light. This journey through the next world was not imagined in one fixed way across all periods, and that is important. Egyptian religion was durable, but it was never frozen. Different texts describe different routes, different challenges, and different emphases. Yet across these changing traditions, the dead were repeatedly imagined as travelers who needed knowledge. Names of gates mattered. The identities of guardians mattered. Correct speech mattered. To know what to say was to survive. To be ignorant was to remain vulnerable. This is one reason the Egyptian afterlife feels so vivid even now. It is not passive. The deceased does not merely lie down and awaken in paradise. He or she must move, answer, identify, transform, avoid threats, and present a defensible self before divine powers. The underworld, often referred to as the Duat, was not simply a shadowy destination. It was a process of passage. The dead had to cross it successfully. They needed spells to protect them in dangerous situations, and different copies of the Book of the Dead preserve different selections of those spells, depending on the needs and resources of the person buried with them. There is something profoundly revealing in that dependence on knowledge. The Egyptians did not imagine eternity as a vague reward given automatically to everyone who happened to die in the right land. They imagined a cosmos in which order existed, but in which one still had to align with it. The dead person entering the next world was not stripped of identity into some universal sameness. Instead, identity became even more important. One had to know one's own name, preserve one's heart, keep one's body intact, and speak with confidence among divine beings. In many funerary spells, the deceased declares, identifies, equates, or denies. These are acts of self-making. Even in death, a person had to remain legible. A successful afterlife was not only about being preserved by others, it was also about being able to stand within a great divine order and say, in effect, I am still here. I know who I am. I know where I am going. And I know the words that keep me safe. That world beyond the tomb was filled with hazards because the Egyptians did not trust death to become harmless merely because ritual had begun. Serpents, hostile beings, demons, knives, locked doors, lakes, darkness, and disorientation all appear in funerary texts and images. Some of these threats seem monstrous to us. Some feel bureaucratic, like a cosmos made of checkpoints and tests. But together, they express something very human. Death is frightening not only because it ends life, but because it creates uncertainty. The Egyptians answered that uncertainty by naming it, drawing it, and writing against it. A person equipped with the proper spells could ask for passage, identify a guardian, repel a snake, avoid punishment, and continue onward. The dead, in this system, were not helpless shades. They were travelers, carrying ritual literacy as a weapon. This is one reason Egyptian funerary manuscripts feel less like mournful poetry and more like active equipment. They were meant to be used. And yet, for all the dangers, the central emotional climax of the Egyptian afterlife was not a battle, but a weighing. At the end of the journey, or at least at one of its decisive moments, came judgment. The heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the principle and goddess of truth, justice, rightness, and cosmic balance. This was no trivial symbolic gesture. The heart, in Egyptian thought, was not merely a pump of blood. It was the seat of thought, memory, character, and moral record. It knew what a person had done. It carried the truth of a life. To have one's heart weighed was therefore to be measured at the deepest level, not by public reputation, not by tomb wealth, not by the beauty of one's coffin, but by what one had actually been. Anubis presides over the weighing in many scenes, adjusting or supervising the scales, while Thoth, divine scribe, records the result. Beyond them waits Osiris, enthroned as Lord of the Dead, receiving the justified. This scene appears again and again because it distilled the Egyptian moral imagination into one unforgettable image. A human life, balanced against the order of the cosmos itself. The famous negative confession associated with spell 125 of the Book of the Dead deepens this drama. In it, the deceased addresses a company of divine judges and declares what he or she has not done, not stolen, not murdered unjustly, not lied, not cheated, not desecrated, not acted with cruelty in specific ways. The list varies in interpretation and context, but the broad point is clear. The Egyptian afterlife was moral. Preservation of the body and provision of spells did not bypass ethical scrutiny. the dead person still had to present a life compatible with Ma'at. This matters because it saves Egyptian funerary religion from the caricature that ritual alone was everything. Ritual was essential, yes, but ritual and moral order were intertwined. The person who hoped to pass safely into blessed existence needed more than an intact mummy. He or she needed a heart that would not betray its owner when placed on the scale. That is precisely why heart scarabs could be so important, for they carried texts intended to restrain the heart from testifying against the deceased. Even here, one sees the elegant complexity of Egyptian thought. Morality, ritual, and magical protection all converged at the same decisive moment. Failure at judgment was terrifying, not because it meant eternal torture, in the way later religious traditions sometimes imagine damnation, but because it meant loss, destruction, or exclusion from the hoped-for continuation of being. In many popular accounts, the devourer Amit waits beside the scales, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, the assembled ferocity of Egypt's most dangerous creatures. If the heart fails, she devours it. The symbolic force of that image is astonishing. The very center of the self, the organ that remembers and testifies, can be consumed. What then remains of the person? Egyptian religion often aimed at continued effective existence, not endless punishment for its own sake. So the horror of failure lies in non-continuance, in the inability to become an effective blessed dead. One does not proceed into the beautiful fields beyond. One does not join the justified. One does not continue in wholeness. The threat is annihilating precisely because the Egyptians cared so much about continuity. But if the heart balanced with Ma'at, then another world opened. The dead person could enter what is often translated as the field of reeds, or field of rushes, an idealized version of Egypt itself, fertile, ordered, abundant, and serene. This is one of the most beautiful aspects of Egyptian afterlife belief. The paradise was not an abstract realm of detached bliss. It was recognizable. It had waterways, fields, harvests, and familiar forms of life, but perfected and secured against suffering. In some descriptions, the justified dead farm reap, eat, drink, and enjoy the kind of existence they valued on earth, without the distortions of pain, scarcity, and mortality. This was not an escape from all form into pure spirit. It was a redeemed continuation of life in its best and most stable condition. The afterlife, in other words, was not necessarily other in the sense of being alien. It was home, made safe forever. That idealized continuation explains so much else about Egyptian burial customs. Tomb paintings of fields, food, servants, banquets, boats, gardens, and music were not sentimental decoration. They anticipated and supported the life the dead hoped to enter. Grave goods were not random luxuries. They belonged to a world view in which the dead still needed orientation within a recognizable order of existence. The justified dead did not become featureless points of light. They remained themselves, yet renewed. They could move, eat, drink, speak, see, and be among gods and perhaps among loved ones. The afterlife restored what death had threatened to steal. Everything in burial ritual had aimed toward that possibility. The preserved body, the restored senses, the protected heart, the recited spells, the written name, the offerings left by the living, all of it converged on a single hope. that the person might continue in fullness, not merely survive as a trace. Even the phrase "coming forth by day" carries this feeling of regained presence. To come forth is not to remain trapped. To do so by day is not to remain in darkness. Egyptian afterlife belief is often associated with tombs and night, but the deepest aspiration is movement into light, visibility, and freedom. Some funerary scenes show the dead emerging, adoring the rising sun, or joining cosmic cycles that defeat darkness through repetition. This is where the connection to solar theology becomes especially powerful. Just as the sun entered night and returned at dawn, so too the dead hoped to pass through hidden regions and emerge renewed. In this sense, every dawn in Egypt could be read as reassurance. The pattern already existed in the sky. Disappearance was not final. Hiddenness could be followed by return. The dead, if properly prepared and justified, might participate in that same rhythm of vanishing and reappearance. What makes all of this so compelling is that the Egyptian vision of the next world was neither naive nor despairing. It did not pretend there was no danger, no judgment, no possibility of failure, but neither did it surrender to formless dread. Instead, it created structure. It gave names to gates, faces to guardians, words to the dead, scales to judgment, and fields to hope. It imagined divine scrutiny without abandoning divine hospitality. The deceased might tremble before the scales, but there was something beyond the scales worth reaching. That balance between danger and promise is one reason Egyptian mortuary religion endured so long. It took death seriously enough to arm against it, and life seriously enough to want it restored. And perhaps that is why even now, the judgment scenes on Egyptian papyri still feel so immediate. Anubis leads the dead forward. The heart is weighed. Thoth records. Osiris waits. Amit crouches nearby. The whole drama is exquisitely composed, but beneath the elegance lies a fear every civilization knows. What remains of a person when life is over, and what counts when all surfaces are stripped away? The Egyptians answered with a scene at once ceremonial and intimate. What counts is the heart. What counts is alignment with truth, balance, and rightness. What counts is whether the life inside the body that's been so carefully preserved can stand before eternity without collapsing under its own weight. It is a remarkable thought. After all the linen, resin, gold, wood, stone, prayers, processions, and tears, the final test still turns inward. The dead person must meet the measure of ma'at. For all the care that ancient Egyptians devoted to the dead, there was one fear that never disappeared. It stood behind the thick walls of tombs, behind hidden entrances, behind curses, priestly rites, sealed coffins, and stone sarcophagi. It was the fear that eternity itself could be broken open by human hands. The Egyptians preserved the dead because they believed the body mattered. They stocked the tomb because they believed the dead still needed provision. They wrote names and spells because they believed memory and language helped sustain a person beyond death. But what if the tomb was robbed? The coffin smashed, the jewelry stripped away, the wrappings cut open, the mummy damaged, the name forgotten. What then became of the dead person for whom all this labour had been performed? This is the darker side of Egyptian burial history, and in some ways, one of the most revealing. Because to study ancient Egyptian funerary custom honestly, one must follow not only the ideal of eternal rest, but the repeated collapse of that ideal under poverty, greed, political weakness, and time itself. The story of mummification is not only the story of how the Egyptians protected the dead, it is also the story of how often the dead had to be rescued, repaired, and hidden, all over again. Tomb robbery was not a late accident that spoiled an otherwise perfect system. It was a persistent reality across Egyptian history, one that reveals how fragile even the grandest promises of eternity could be. To a modern imagination, tomb robbery is almost inseparable from Egypt. Gold masks, broken seals, secret chambers, vanished treasures, looted sarcophagi, and hidden caches have become part of the cultural myth. But for the Egyptians themselves, this was no adventure. It was a spiritual emergency. A robbed tomb was not simply a stolen vault. It was an assault on the dead. To break into a burial was to tear apart the carefully constructed conditions of afterlife survival. Jewelry might be stripped from a mummy because it was valuable. But in Egyptian terms, the act meant more than theft. It meant violation of a sacred body, interruption of offerings, desecration of ritual space, and possible damage to the identity of the deceased. Even if the thief cared only for gold, the consequence touched the very heart of Egyptian beliefs about continuity after death. The tomb had been built as a machine of preservation. Tomb robbery forced the terrifying question of whether that machine could fail, and fail it often did. The Egyptians knew this from very early on. Many ancient tombs, including royal burials, were plundered not centuries later by foreigners or treasure hunters, but by Egyptians themselves, sometimes not long after burial. The problem was deeply structural. Tombs were designed to protect wealth and sacred objects for eternity. But visible wealth attracts attention. The richer the burial, the greater the temptation. Gold, silver, precious stones, fine linen, oils, amulets, and ceremonial equipment all had immediate practical value in the world of the living. No matter how fiercely religion condemned the act, no matter how severe the punishments, no matter how elaborate the tomb's defenses, the dead lay surrounded by things the living wanted. In periods of stability, official protection could reduce the danger, but in periods of weakness, unpaid workers, corrupt guards, local desperation, and political fragmentation made theft much harder to control. The tomb, for all its stone and ceremony, remained vulnerable to hunger, greed, and disorder. That is part of what makes Egyptian tomb robbery so haunting. It was not always the work of distant strangers slipping through the desert at night. Sometimes it involved people who knew the necropolis intimately. The closer one gets to the history, the less romantic it becomes. Burials were often violated by people with knowledge of tomb construction, access routes, burial timing, security practices, or the value of funerary goods. At times, the very structures designed to maintain sacred order were compromised by the same social breakdown that made tomb goods attractive in the first place. During the troubled years toward the end of the New Kingdom, evidence suggests that tomb robbery became severe enough to provoke official investigations. The state that had once built hidden royal tombs in remote valleys found itself increasingly unable to guarantee their safety. That failure is historically important. The Egyptian afterlife depended on continuity, but continuity itself required a functioning society to protect the dead. When central power weakened, even royal eternity became insecure. The emotional force of this can be hard to overstate. Imagine what a royal burial represented. The king's body had been embalmed with the greatest skill available. Amulets and texts had been set in place. The tomb had been carved, painted, and sealed. Priests had performed the rites. Offerings had been made. The burial was not only personal, but cosmic. It declared that kingship would continue beyond death and remain effective within divine order. And still, in later years, robbers could break through stone, strip metal fittings, cut through wrappings, and scatter what had been assembled with such care. The contrast between the ideal and the reality is devastating. One sees in it the vulnerability of all human attempts to create permanence. The Egyptians built some of the most durable funerary structures in history, but human desperation could still pry them open. Yet the Egyptian response to this crisis was not simple despair. Again and again, they tried to repair the damage. This is one of the most moving aspects of later funerary history. Priests and officials in the Third Intermediate Period, faced with widespread tomb violation, began recovering royal mummies and reinterring them in caches for safekeeping. Bodies once laid in magnificent tombs were removed, rewrapped, identified, and placed together in hidden collective locations. Among them, the famous cache known as DB 320 near Thebes, where many New Kingdom royals were eventually reburied. This was not the eternity originally intended for them. They were not resting in the splendid isolation of their own decorated tomb chambers any longer, but they were being protected in the only way still possible. The logic of care persisted even after the first funerary plan had failed. Priests could no longer always defend the original tomb, so they defended the body itself. In a strange and poignant way, this was mummification all over again. The dead had to be saved from destruction by being handled, repaired, and hidden anew. The reburial of royal and elite remains reveals a quieter side of Egyptian mortuary religion, one less often dramatized than the burial of a king in his original splendor. It shows us caretakers generations later, opening damaged coffins, confronting torn wrappings, recovering names, and attempting to restore order where disorder had entered. There is something deeply touching in that labor. These were not the original mourners. They were not the family of the deceased in the immediate sense. Yet they still felt bound by obligation to the dead. Even after centuries, the kings remained persons whose bodies mattered. The priests, who rewrapped and reburied them, acted within the same broad moral and religious framework that had guided the first burial. The dead should not be abandoned to desecration. If their treasures could not be preserved, at least their bodies and names might be saved. It is difficult not to see in that effort a kind of delayed tenderness, an attempt to rescue dignity from ruin. Individual cases make this especially vivid. The Met's records for the mummy and coffin of Prince Amenemhat note that his original burial was robbed in antiquity, and that his mummy was later reburied in a simple child's coffin from a later era. His rewrapped body was supplied with floral garlands and food offerings, modest but careful acts that suggest he was not merely discarded into storage. He was reburied with intention. This single example tells an entire story in miniature. A prince once buried with proper status loses the security of his original resting place, is stripped from it by ancient violation, and then is gathered again by later hands that still recognize the claim of the dead upon the living. One can almost feel the sadness of it. The first eternity has failed, but a second, humbler one is attempted in its place. The existence of such reburials also complicates modern ideas about the untouched tomb as the only authentic form of Egyptian burial. Ancient Egyptians themselves reopened tombs under certain circumstances, not to desecrate, but to preserve. They moved mummies, reinscribed names, replaced coffins, and bundled generations together in protective secrecy. This was not ideal, but it was meaningful. The afterlife was flexible enough to allow repair. Continuity could be threatened, but not always destroyed. That resilience is one reason Egyptian burial traditions endured for so long. They were not dependent on one flawless moment at the funeral alone. They could adapt, respond, and attempt restoration when the original arrangements were damaged. The body, once preserved, could still be re-preserved. The dead, once endangered, could still be hidden again from danger. Punishments for tomb robbing, when enforceable, were severe, which tells us how seriously the crime was taken. Ancient Egyptian law treated tomb robbery as a grave offense, sometimes punishable by death or mutilation. Such penalties were meant not only to protect property, but to defend sacred order. A tomb robber did not merely steal wealth. He attacked the security of the dead and violated the religious fabric that linked burial, memory, and divine justice. But harsh laws alone could not eliminate the temptation. In times of political or economic stress, even those charged with keeping order might be compromised. The persistence of tomb robbery, despite religious fear and legal severity, reveals something almost brutally realistic about Egyptian society. They may have believed strongly in the afterlife, but belief did not erase need, corruption, or desire. Religious conviction and criminal action lived side by side. The existence of one did not cancel the possibility of the other. There is, too, a larger lesson here about the Egyptian relationship with material things. Grave goods mattered because they were not trivial decorations. They were part of the dead person's continuing identity and provision. Yet it was precisely because they were materially valuable that they were vulnerable. The same gold that signaled divine radiance and elite status in the tomb could be melted down outside it. The same amulet that protected the dead could be stripped from a chest by a living thief who valued metal more than ritual power. Burial therefore sat at the intersection of sacred meaning and material temptation. No wonder so many Egyptian tombs were eventually found emptied or damaged. The funerary system had placed extraordinary concentrations of wealth in places the living were ordered not to disturb. That prohibition was powerful, but not always powerful enough. And yet what survived is still astonishing. Not every tomb was destroyed. Not every mummy was lost. Some burials remained hidden. Some were partially looted, but still preserved immense information. Some, like Tutankhamun's, survived with enough intact material to reshape modern understanding of Egyptian burial altogether. Others survived only through fragments, inscriptions, scattered amulets, broken sarcophagi, or rewrapped bodies found in caches. But even damaged tombs speak. In a strange sense, robbery itself became part of the archaeological record. Cut wrappings, missing inlays, resealed entrances, replacement coffins, mixed assemblages, and reburial caches. all tell a second history. The history of what happened after the official funeral was over. The tomb did not simply stand outside time untouched. It entered history. It suffered history. This matters for your story because it gives Egyptian burial rituals a deeper emotional arc. The Egyptians did not merely invent a majestic system and then watch it function perfectly for 3,000 years. They built, lost, repaired, concealed, restored, and tried again. Their relationship with the dead was active and ongoing. The living had to keep faith, not only at the moment of burial, but in later generations, under worse conditions, when older tombs had already been broken and bodies already disturbed. Priests of later periods became custodians of damaged eternity. That role is as important to the story as the embalmers at the beginning. One group prepared the dead for the next world. The other defended those same dead when the world of the living turned violent against them. There is something almost unbearably human in this. We tend to imagine ancient Egypt in still images, sealed tombs, calm sarcophagi, silent corridors. But the real story is full of interruption. A burial could be splendid and then broken. A king could be entombed in gold and centuries later rewrapped in secrecy. A prince could lose his original coffin and gain another. A necropolis could shift from sacred order to desperate vulnerability and back into partial care. The dream of permanence never fully overcame the instability of history, and yet the Egyptians never stopped trying. They responded to robbery not by giving up on the dead, but by protecting them in new ways. That persistence may be one of the noblest things in their funerary tradition. When eternity cracked, they tried to mend it. If the tomb was the last place the living could follow, the afterlife was where imagination, fear, and hope had to continue the journey alone. For the ancient Egyptians, burial did not guarantee peace any more than preservation guaranteed salvation. The mummy might be intact, the coffin painted, the amulets secured, the name written clearly, and the offerings laid in order. But beyond the sealed chamber, another passage still waited. This was the realm modern readers often call the underworld. Though the Egyptian vision was more layered than a simple kingdom of the dead. It was a place of gates, roads, ferries, guardians, darkness, judgment, and renewal. It was dangerous, but not meaningless. The dead did not wander there forever without purpose. They moved through it toward a hoped-for condition of blessed existence, provided they knew the way, survived the trials, and proved worthy before the gods. That is why funerary texts mattered so deeply. They were not decorative literature placed beside the dead out of reverence for words. They were a guidebook, a defense, a script, and a store of power for the road ahead. The ancient collection modern scholars call the Book of the Dead was more properly understood as spells for coming forth by day, a phrase that already reveals the emotional center of the Egyptian hope, not endless burial, but emergence, restoration, and renewed presence in the light. By the time Egypt came under Greek and then Roman rule, the old world of mummification had already been ancient for centuries. Dynasties had risen and dissolved, capitals had shifted, priests had guarded traditions through instability, royal tombs had been robbed and royal mummies hidden away, yet still the dead were wrapped, protected, and prepared with the same underlying hope that had shaped burial since the earliest ages of the Nile. That continuity matters because it would have been easy for the funerary customs of ancient Egypt to vanish under foreign rule. New kings ruled from outside old bloodlines. New artistic styles entered the land. Greek language spread through administration and elite life. Roman power eventually absorbed Egypt into an empire whose center lay far beyond the Nile Valley. And yet burial remained one of the strongest places where Egyptian ways endured. It changed, yes, sometimes dramatically in appearance, but not in its deepest emotional core. The dead still required care. The body still mattered. Eternity still had to be prepared for. What we see in these later periods is not the sudden disappearance of Egyptian burial ritual, but its remarkable ability to absorb, adapt, and continue even while the surrounding world was transformed. Roman period mummy portraits, for example, were sometimes placed over the heads of mummies, showing that new visual habits could merge with older embalming traditions, rather than simply replace them. The Ptolemaic period, beginning after the conquest of Alexander and shaped by the rule of Greek-speaking monarchs, did not erase the religious prestige of older Egyptian forms. Temples continued to function. Priests continued to perform rites. Sacred texts were still copied, adapted, and preserved. The dead continued to be mummified. If anything, later Egyptian culture often shows a deliberate attachment to older forms, as though continuity itself had become precious. One can imagine why. Foreign rule makes tradition feel fragile, and when a people fear political change, they often cling more tightly to the customs surrounding birth, worship, and death. Burial offered a way to remain Egyptian even in a world where power spoke another language. The body in its wrappings, the protective symbols, the funerary rites, and the care for the name all continue to assert a very old answer to mortality. The tomb still said what it had always said. This person is not to be abandoned to decay or oblivion. At the same time, these later centuries brought visible changes in style and presentation. Cartonnage, painted shrouds, gilded masks, and increasingly elaborate external decoration could dominate the appearance of a burial. In some mummies from the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, the wrapping itself becomes a dazzling surface of pattern and image. The body remains preserved within, but the outside now speaks in a richer visual language, shaped by both old Egyptian iconography and new tastes. This is one of the most fascinating turns in the story. The Egyptian dead were not frozen in time as replicas of an earlier age. They could be presented through the artistic vocabulary of changing centuries. A mummy from Roman Egypt might wear the visual signals of Roman clothing and hairstyle while still resting in linen wrappings, governed by the much older logic of Egyptian afterlife preparation. The result is neither purely Greek, nor purely Egyptian, nor purely Roman. It is a layered identity, a dead body prepared at the meeting point of civilizations. The Met's mummy of Artemidora shows exactly this blend. An elaborate mask and Egyptian-style wig coexist with Roman-style dress details, preserving older funerary purpose through a mixed visual language. Nothing expresses this fusion more hauntingly than the so-called Fayum mummy portraits. These painted panels, attached to mummies in Roman Egypt, are among the most arresting funerary objects from the ancient world. A modern viewer encountering them for the first time often feels an almost uncomfortable shock, because these are not stylized faces in the older Egyptian mode. They are individual-looking men, women, and children. rendered in a more naturalistic style, with luminous eyes, carefully modelled skin, distinctive hairstyles, and the suggestion of living presence. They date largely to the 1st through 3rd centuries AD, and many are associated with the Fayum region and sites such as Hawara, which became an important Roman period burial ground. These portraits didn't replace mummification, they were placed on mummified remains. That fact is crucial. What changed was the face presented to eternity. Instead of an idealized funerary mask alone, the dead might carry an image that looked startlingly personal, as though the living had tried to pin the individuality of a real human face against the silence of burial. It would be easy to treat those portraits as evidence that older Egyptian religion had finally dissolved into something else. But the reality is more subtle. The portraits belong to a long Egyptian concern with preserving likeness and identity, even if they express that concern through techniques associated with the wider Greco-Roman world. The dead had always needed a body, a name, an image, and some durable point of reference through which personhood could continue. Statues, coffin faces, painted shrouds, and idealized masks had long served related purposes. The mummy portrait takes that old need and meets it with a new style. It tells us that continuity in ancient religion often survives not by refusing all change, but by inhabiting new forms. The dead person still lies wrapped in linen according to Egyptian mortuary custom. The portrait simply offers another way of saying, "This is who rests here. Do not let this person vanish into anonymity." UCL notes that the Hawara panels date to Roman rule and functioned as portrait coverings for mummified people, preserving the link between realistic painted faces and older wrapped burial. These later burials also remind us that mummification was not limited to pharaohs or to some remote and static golden age. Children, women, local elites, priests, and people living under Roman administration could still receive mummified burial. Museum collections preserve examples of Roman period mummies with gilded masks, painted shrouds, carefully wrapped bodies, and personal names that make them feel close to us in an unsettling way. The British Museum's Roman period mummy of Cleopatra, daughter of Candace, wrapped with a painted shroud and buried with small personal objects including a comb and wreath, shows how intimate these burials could remain even in a late age of empire. These are not abstractions. They are individual people whose families still felt the same old obligation to prepare them for death with tenderness, display, and ritual meaning. The empire changed around them, but within the coffin, the old Egyptian demand remained: preserve the person. The persistence of animal mummification in the late period through Roman times adds another layer to this story. Animal mummies, whether sacred, votive, or funerary in function, continue to be produced on a vast scale. Crocodiles, shrews, ibises, cats, and other creatures were wrapped and deposited in temple-linked cemeteries or sacred contexts, often tied to devotion toward particular deities. This matters because it shows that the culture of preservation was still alive, not just at the level of private family burial, but within broader religious practice. Mummification remained a way of mediating between human worship and divine powers. In some animal cemeteries, the scale is astonishing, suggesting organized ritual systems and continuing public participation. The wrapped animal body, like the human one, had become a familiar sacred form within Egyptian religion, and that form survived well into periods of foreign rule. Yet not everything remained unchanged. In later periods, some burial equipment became more symbolic than functional. Canopic jars, for instance, might continue to appear even when embalming practice had shifted and organs were handled differently or returned to the body. Decorative emphasis could intensify while actual methods varied in quality from one workshop to another. This does not mean later burial was empty imitation. Rather, it suggests that religious symbols sometimes outlast the specific technical procedures from which they arose. A society that has used the same mortuary imagery for centuries begins to carry certain signs forward because they still communicate safety, legitimacy, and sacred continuity. Even when practice changes, symbolism may remain because people are not willing to let go of what the symbol has long promised. A canopic form still says protection. A gilded face still says transformation. A wrapped body still says preparation for the next world. There is also something psychologically powerful in the later visual style of these mummies. Earlier Egyptian burial often emphasized ideal form and cosmic identity. Later Roman period portraits, by contrast, can feel intimate and personal in a very different way. The gaze of the painted dead meets our own. We do not just see the deceased as Osiris or the transfigured blessed one. We see a particular face with shadowed eyes, curly hair, fine jewelry, or the softness of youth. This does not cancel older religious meanings, but it does shift the emotional tone. It makes the dead feel closer to their living mourners, closer perhaps even to us. One can imagine a family commissioning such a portrait not only because it fit elite taste, but because it preserved something vivid and irreplaceable about the loved one who had died. In that sense, the Fayum portraits are not foreign intrusions into Egyptian burial, so much as one more powerful answer to the oldest Egyptian fear of all, that the dead might lose their individuality, and still, the ancient tension remained. No matter how elegant the portrait or ornate the wrappings, the dead body was entering a fragile future. Tombs could still be disturbed. Burial grounds could still be looted. Time could still damage what love had preserved. The later periods did not solve the problem of mortality any better than the earlier ones had. What they did show, however, was an extraordinary refusal to stop trying. Even under Roman power, even in a world of mixed languages and overlapping identities, Egyptians and Egypt-based communities continue to care for their dead with ritual seriousness. They still wrapped bodies. They still added funerary decoration. They still provided names and faces and symbols. They still insisted across changing empires that death required more than disposal. It required form, care, and continuity. In a way, the later history of Egyptian burial is one of the clearest proofs of how strong the older beliefs had always been. Political authority can change rapidly. Art styles can shift within generations. Languages can mix. But the things people do for their dead tend to preserve deeper loyalties than almost anything else. Burial customs reveal what a culture cannot easily surrender. In Egypt, even after centuries of change, people still could not surrender the conviction that the body mattered, that the dead deserved presence, and that some form of identity could be carried across the grave through image, wrapping, ritual, and remembrance. The Roman period mummy portrait is therefore not the end of Egyptian burial tradition in any simple sense. It is one of its last and most beautiful transformations. Behind every mummy, every painted coffin, every jar, every garland, every spell written in careful black and red ink, there were living hands. It is easy, when telling the story of Egyptian mummification, to let the dead dominate the scene. Their wrapped bodies survive. Their tombs remain. Their masks and portraits stare back at us across thousands of years, but none of it happened by itself. Every burial was a work of the living. Priests purified the body. Embalmers learned its vulnerable places. Artisans painted coffins and carved names. Scribes copied spells. Family members commissioned grave goods, offered food, mourned aloud, and returned to the tomb to sustain the dead through memory and ritual. The funerary world of ancient Egypt was not only a theology of what happened after death, it was also a social labour performed by communities who refused to let their dead pass unattended into silence. Smithsonian notes that special priests worked as embalmers, combining ritual knowledge with detailed anatomical skill during the 70-day mummification process. The embalmers themselves occupied one of the strangest and most important roles in Egyptian society. They worked in intimate proximity to death, touching what ordinary grief often recoils from touching, and yet they did so under sacred authority. This was not the work of mere body disposal. It was a technical and religious vocation. The body had to be washed, opened, dried, packed, wrapped, and equipped in the right order, and every stage required specialized knowledge. Priests involved in embalming were expected not only to know the rituals and prayers, but also to understand the structure of the human body well enough to remove what would decay too quickly and preserve what remained. In Egypt, that kind of skill was not opposed to religion. It was one of religion's tools. The embalmers stood at the place where theology became touch. They handled the dead not as refuse, but as persons in transition, fragile and sacred at once. That combination of ritual and anatomy says a great deal about how the Egyptians understood care. Modern societies often separate spiritual care from technical care, but Egyptian burial brought them together. One could not prepare a body for the next world with prayer alone, nor with craft alone. The dead required both. This is one reason embalming workshops feel so extraordinary in retrospect. They were not simply workrooms. They were places where the fate of a human being was actively shaped through skilled intervention. The embalmers had to know how to preserve form, but they also had to respect the body's ritual significance. A poorly preserved corpse threatened afterlife continuity. A ritually neglected corpse was no better. In that sense, the embalmer's craft was an act of protection against two kinds of ruin at once: physical decay and sacred incompletion. Then there were the priests who stood beside or within these processes, reciting words that transform practical actions into sacred passage. Egyptian funerary religion depended deeply on spoken efficacy. Priests purified, invoked, identified, and restored. They did not merely bless what others had done. Their words were part of what made the work real. A wrapped body had to be addressed. A statue had to be activated. A mummy had to be restored symbolically to sight, speech, breathing, and nourishment. That is why rites such as the opening of the mouth mattered so much. The ritual gave back capacities that death had taken away, enabling the deceased to function in the afterlife. The Australian Museum's summary of ancient Egyptian funerals notes that the embalmed body was taken in procession to the tomb, where the opening of the mouth ceremony was performed at the entrance. The mortuary priest was therefore not just a performer in ceremonial costume. He was a mediator between worlds. He stood where the living could still act on behalf of the dead, and his actions gave form to that loyalty. In offering scenes from tombs and tomb chapels, priests present food and drink before the deceased, burn incense, and maintain the ritual economy that allowed the dead to remain sustained. The Met's educational resources note that scenes of the deceased receiving offerings represent the successful outcome of funerary rites, with the dead now in blessed status and nourished eternally, and that the eldest son often had responsibility for parts of the mortuary cult. That detail matters because it shows that priestly labor and family obligation often overlapped. The dead were not maintained by institutions alone. They were maintained by kinship as well. Family, in fact, may be the emotional heart of the whole funerary system. We often focus on kings, priests, and elite tomb art because they survive most visibly. But every burial began with people who had lost someone. A mother, a husband, a son, a brother, a household, a circle of dependents, a community. The rituals of ancient Egypt were elaborate, but at their center was a grief that still feels recognizable. Someone had died, and the living were trying to do right by them. They washed the body or entrusted it to those who could. They paid for wrappings and coffins according to their means. They attended the procession. They lamented. They made offerings. They visited the tomb. They spoke the name. These acts were religious, certainly, but they were also acts of love, obligation, and fear. The fear was not only that death had happened, but that the dead person might be left vulnerable afterward. Egyptian burial ritual gave families a way to resist that vulnerability. Tomb scenes make this bond visible in subtle ways. Children bring offerings. The deceased sits before a table piled with bread and drink. A wife may appear beside her husband. Servants and relatives approach with goods. These are not only displays of status, they are continuations of relationship. The dead still belong within a social network. The oldest son, in particular, could carry key responsibilities in funerary provision, ensuring that offerings continued and the deceased was not cut off from the nourishment and remembrance required for eternal life. That pattern reflects something deeply important about Egyptian burial beliefs. The afterlife was not secured by one dramatic funeral day alone. It depended on ongoing maintenance. A dead person with no one to remember them, no one to leave offerings, and no one to speak their name stood in a much more precarious position. Memory itself was a kind of sustenance. Mourners formed another essential part of this living circle around the dead. Egyptian funerals could include formal lamentation, dances, processions, and highly visible displays of grief. To modernize, that can seem theatrical, but ancient ritual rarely separates genuine sorrow from prescribed form. The form gives grief somewhere to go. The Australian Museum notes that a funeral procession with dancers and mourners accompanied the embalmed body to the tomb. World History Encyclopedia likewise describes purification, embalming, and the ceremonial transition of the body toward burial. These rituals did not reduce grief to performance. They ritualized grief so that mourning itself became meaningful action. to wail, to beat the breast, to cry out for the dead, to accompany them publicly across the threshold of burial. All of this placed private loss inside a larger sacred story. There is also a social truth here that sometimes gets missed. Funerals were among the moments when a person's place in society became most visible. Wealth shaped the scale of burial. Status shaped tomb decoration, goods, and priestly service. But even when inequality was obvious, the funeral also revealed a more universal Egyptian conviction. Every properly buried person deserved some form of continuation. The richest tombs and the humblest graves differed enormously, yet both participated in the same basic refusal to let death be merely disposal. A poor burial might lack gold, painted chambers, or a papyrus of spells, but it could still carry care, wrapping, amuletic protection, food offerings, and the determination to preserve identity. Egyptian burial was never egalitarian in material terms, but it was remarkably consistent in the idea that the dead should not be abandoned without ritual attention. Artisans, too, deserved their place in this story. Scribes copied funerary texts. Painters rendered offering scenes, deities, and the faces of the dead. Woodworkers shaped coffins. Stonecutters carved false doors, stelae and sarcophagi. Makers of linen supplied the wrappings themselves. Goldsmiths, jewelers, and amulet makers contributed protective and status-marking objects. The result was that a funeral in ancient Egypt could mobilize an entire network of skilled labor. This is one reason funerary culture became such a large and enduring part of Egyptian civilization. It was not confined to theology alone. It sustained workshops, temple economies, artistic traditions, and scribal practices across centuries. The dead did not simply receive goods from a family's grief. They also drew into their orbit a whole material culture of specialists whose work turned loss into lasting form. Offering chamber scenes published by the Met show mortuary priests and bearers carrying food and drink toward the deceased. A reminder that burial was always collective labor. This collective labor becomes especially vivid when one imagines the funeral not as a static image, but as a sequence of tasks unfolding in time. A death occurs. The body is prepared. Choices are made according to means. Relatives gather. Priests are summoned. Materials are assembled. Coffins are painted. Spells may be commissioned. The body spends weeks in embalming. Processions are planned. Offerings are prepared. The tomb is stocked. The burial day arrives. The dead are carried out, mourned, and installed. Then the work continues afterward, because tomb visits and offering rituals do not necessarily stop. In other words, Egyptian burial was not a moment. It was a campaign of care. That helps explain why it could feel so necessary and so emotionally persuasive. It gave grief, duration, order, and a list of meaningful things that still could be done. One of the most moving dimensions of this campaign of care is that it was never wholly private and never wholly public. The dead person belonged to a household, but also to a wider sacred order. A family might mourn someone as father, wife, daughter, or master. Priests and artists might address the same person as deceased, justified, Osiris so-and-so, worthy of offerings. Both levels coexisted. The loved one became part of a cosmic drama, yet remained recognizably themselves. That duality runs through Egyptian burial culture. The dead are universalized into ritual form, but they do not vanish into anonymity. their names are preserved. Their faces are idealized or painted. Their kin bring food. Their children are shown before them. Their jobs and titles are inscribed. Their personal memory is sheltered within the machinery of eternity. There is an intimacy hidden inside even the grandest tomb. Behind the polished liturgy lies someone who had to decide which linens to use, someone who wept in the procession, someone who commissioned the coffin face, someone who hoped the spells were copied correctly, someone who would later stand before the offering table and say the name aloud. The ancient Egyptian mortuary system can look overwhelming because it is so rich in symbols and procedures, but in lived experience, it must often have felt more immediate. It was what people did when they could not bear the thought of losing the dead completely. They enlisted priests because priests knew the words. They enlisted embalmers because embalmers knew the body. They enlisted artists because images could last. They enlisted the tomb because stone could remember longer than flesh. Each specialist took one portion of grief and turned it into a durable form. Long after the embalmers had finished their work, long after the priests had spoken the final words, and the tomb entrances had been sealed with mud, plaster, or stone, long after family voices had faded from the offering chapel, and the desert had begun its patient work of covering tracks, another chapter in the story of Egyptian burial rituals began. It was not a chapter the ancient Egyptians intended. They had built tombs to protect the dead from intrusion, to preserve names against forgetting, and to keep bodies safe inside a sacred architecture of eternity. But history does not always honor intention. Kingdoms collapsed, temples fell silent, scripts became unreadable, and the meanings once alive inside the tomb grew dim. Then, centuries later, new hands arrived. Travelers, collectors, grave robbers, antiquarians, archaeologists, museum curators, anatomists, chemists, radiologists, and curious audiences all took their turn approaching the Egyptian dead. The tomb, once meant to close forever, opened again. The mummy, once wrapped for eternity, became an object of fascination in a new world that no longer shared the original religious beliefs, but could not look away from the bodies that belief had preserved. The result is one of the strangest afterlives in human history. Ancient Egyptians prepared their dead to survive the next world. Instead, many of them also survived into ours. The first modern encounters were often clumsy, acquisitive, and driven more by wonder than by understanding. For centuries, Egyptian mummies circulated through trade, curiosity cabinets, and private collections. Some were reduced to commodities. In earlier periods of European collecting, mummy remains were sometimes unwrapped publicly as spectacle, treated as exotic evidence from a mysterious ancient civilization, rather than as the bodies of once living people whose preservation had deep, sacred meaning. This phase in the modern history of mummies tells us as much about the modern world as about ancient Egypt. The same preserved body that the Egyptians had wrapped to protect identity was now often stripped in front of crowds, mined for objects, or interpreted through fantasies that confuse science, empire, and entertainment. The dead had survived, but not always with dignity. The scientific and collecting culture of the 19th century often placed curiosity above respect. and the mummy became a stage upon which modernity projected its hunger for possession and revelation. There is an irony here that is difficult to ignore. The Egyptians had feared tomb robbery because it violated the dead and tore apart the conditions of eternity. Much later, even when modern excavators acted in the name of scholarship rather than theft, the result could still resemble a second opening of the tomb against the will of the original mourners. Coffins were lifted, wrappings disturbed, and burial assemblages dispersed to museums across the world. To modern archaeology's credit, methods gradually improved, and the discipline increasingly learned to value context rather than treasure alone. But the shift took time. Early excavations were sometimes focused on spectacular objects, while later archaeology came to understand that even humble textiles, broken seals, pollen traces, embalming residues, and coffin placement could tell stories just as vital as gold. In that change, one can see a kind of moral education. The modern world slowly learned that an Egyptian burial was not merely a container of impressive things. It was a carefully structured act whose meaning depended on relationships between body, object, image, text, and place. Remove those elements carelessly, and much of the original significance disappears. As archaeology matured, the Egyptian dead began to speak differently. Excavators no longer sought only splendid treasures, but also information. A mummy was not just an eerie body from antiquity, it became a historical witness. Linen wrappings could reveal weaving techniques and reuse patterns. Resins could reveal trade connections and embalming recipes. Teeth could suggest diet. Bones could disclose injury or labor. Coffins could preserve names, family ties, and local artistic styles. Tomb placement could show changes in political geography and religious emphasis. This is the point at which the modern encounter with mummies became genuinely transformative. Instead of treating the dead primarily as curiosities, scholars began to recognize them as archives. The body itself, preserved with such care by ancient embalmers, still contained evidence of disease, age, trauma, nutrition, and ritual procedure. A mummy could tell us not only what Egyptians believed about the next life, but how they lived in this one. This transition from spectacle to science did not happen all at once, nor did it eliminate ethical tension. Even the most respectful scientific study still raises difficult questions. What does it mean to examine a dead person who did not consent in modern terms to being displayed, scanned, sampled, or discussed before global audiences? How should museums present human remains that were created within a sacred funerary system meant to preserve dignity and identity? Is it enough to avoid unwrapping and physical destruction, or does the very act of displaying a mummy in a glass case already violate something important? These questions have become increasingly central in museum practice. Institutions now debate whether and how to exhibit mummified remains, how to frame them as people rather than curiosities, and how to balance education with respect. Modern imaging technologies change the conversation profoundly because they lead a way to look without wholly undoing. X-rays, CT scans, endoscopy in limited contexts, residue analysis, and digital reconstruction allowed scholars to study the interior of mummies while keeping wrappings largely intact. This is one of the most remarkable reversals in the history of Egyptian mummy study. For a long time, knowledge seemed to require destruction. To know what lay inside, one had to cut open, unwrap, or dismantle. Now, increasingly, knowledge can pass through the wrappings without tearing them. Ancient embalmers close the body to protect it. Modern imaging opens it again in light rather than with knives. Scans have revealed hidden amulets, embalming packs, fractures, dental abscesses, age estimates, and unexpected details about the treatment of individual remains. In an almost poetic sense, technology has allowed the modern world to become less violent in its curiosity. The scientific study of embalming materials has also deepened appreciation for the sophistication of ancient Egyptian practice. Chemical analyses have identified mixtures of oils, resins, waxes, fats, and plant extracts used to preserve the dead. And these results continue to revise older ideas that mummification was simple or static. Research has shown that even very early Egyptian burials involved recipes with preservative and antibacterial properties, suggesting that embalming knowledge emerged much earlier than once thought. Other studies of later embalming workshops have revealed diverse ingredients, some sourced through long-distance trade, linking funerary preparation to broader economic networks. In other words, a mummy is not only a preserved body, it is also evidence of ancient experimentation, commerce, and material knowledge. Modern science has also exposed the individuality of mummies in ways that can be unexpectedly moving. One body may show a healed fracture, suggesting survival after injury. Another may preserve signs of malnutrition or arthritis. A child mummy may reveal age at death with heartbreaking precision. A royal mummy may show dental disease, family resemblance, or evidence of ancient violence. These details puncture the polished image of the mummy as an abstract emblem of Egypt. They return personhood. The dead become not only examples of ritual, but also specific human beings whose bodies bore the marks of ordinary suffering, work, illness, privilege, and care. This is one of the paradoxes of modern mummy study. Scientific examination can seem cold, yet it often restores intimacy by revealing how physically human these preserved individuals really were. A scan may tell us not only how someone was embalmed, but that they once limped, healed, labored, aged, or endured pain. The person emerges again from the ritual shell. Even so, there remains a tension between knowing and honoring. The more science can discover, the more tempting it becomes to treat the mummy purely as data. But the ancient Egyptians did not create mummies as medical specimens. They created them as protected dead, meant to remain intact, named, and ritually sustained. This is why the best modern work on mummies tries to hold two truths together at once. On one hand, these bodies can teach us an extraordinary amount about ancient society, health, craftsmanship, trade, religion, and lived experience. On the other hand, they are still human remains shaped by a funerary culture that treated them as sacred. A museum that displays a mummy responsibly must somehow preserve both realities: the educational value and the human dignity. Many institutions now do this by including names when known, contextualizing burial beliefs, avoiding sensational language, and inviting visitors to think ethically as well as historically about what they are viewing. This ethical awakening also changes how we tell the story. For generations, popular accounts often emphasized curses, horror, and the uncanny thrill of the preserved corpse. Mummies became monsters in fiction, stripped almost entirely of their original sacred meaning. But a more careful telling restores the actual humanity and seriousness of the ancient practice. A mummy is not frightening because it is grotesque. It is arresting because it is evidence of love, fear, religious hope, and technical skill, all concentrated around one dead person. When modern audiences learn that the heart was preserved for judgment, that the mouth was ritually open so the dead could eat and speak again, that names were carved to defeat oblivion, and that priests later rescued damaged royal mummies from robbed tombs, the mummy ceases to be a mere curiosity. It becomes what it always was, the center of an enormous effort to defend a human being from disappearance. The rediscovery of tombs and mummies has also altered the modern imagination in another way. Because Egyptian burial remains survives so vividly, ancient Egypt often feels closer to us than other ancient civilizations. A ruined palace wall is distant. A wrapped body with hair, teeth, fingertips, and a painted face is intimate. It collapses time. It makes the ancient person impossible to reduce entirely to abstraction. This may be why mummies continue to hold such a strange power over the modern mind. They are at once archaeological artifacts, human remains, and intentional messages from a world that wanted desperately to endure. They confront us with a civilization that planned for death with more material thoroughness than perhaps any other, and they ask us, silently, whether our own ways of remembering the dead are really so different in emotional substance. We may not wrap bodies in linen and place spells beside them, but we still preserve photographs, say names, build monuments, and dread forgetting. The mummy is ancient, but the instinct behind it remains recognizably human. For all the grandeur of pyramids, painted coffins, hidden tombs, golden masks, and priestly rituals, the deepest truth of Egyptian burial customs may be something much quieter. Beneath the stone, beneath the incense, beneath the formal words and sacred gestures, there was always the same human struggle, the struggle against being forgotten. Ancient Egypt wrapped that struggle in beauty and theology more completely than perhaps any other civilization, but at its heart, it was still the same fear that follows every mortal life. What happens when the voice goes silent, when the hands grow still, when a face is no longer seen in the sunlight? Does a person vanish, or can something be done to hold them in the world a little longer, or perhaps forever? The Egyptians answered this question with astonishing seriousness. They did not settle for memory alone. They wanted preservation. They wanted ritual. They wanted protection. They wanted the dead to remain nameable, visible, nourished, and somehow still present within the great order of existence. That desire is what makes their funerary world feel so emotionally powerful, even now. It was never only about death. It was about refusing disappearance. That refusal appears everywhere once one begins to look for it. It is there in the earliest shallow graves where bodies were laid in desert sand with a few humble possessions beside them. It is there in the first experiments with oils and resins, in the growing care taken over burial, in the building of mastabas and pyramids, in the carving of names, in the invention of funerary spells, in the wrapping of limbs, in the placing of amulets, in the offering tables, in the mourning cries, in the painted eyes on coffins, in the hidden caches where later priests rescued violated royal mummies from robbed tombs. Again and again, Across centuries of political rise and collapse, the Egyptians kept making the same argument in new forms. A human being should not simply be left to rot and vanish without defense. The dead deserve structure. The dead deserve continuity. The dead deserve a chance to endure. This is why the body mattered so much. To many modern people, especially those shaped by later ideas in which the soul is imagined as sharply separate from the flesh, the Egyptian obsession with preserving the corpse can seem strange. But in Egyptian thought, the self was never so easily severed from the body. The person after death required integration. The body was not an empty shell to be discarded without consequence. It remained a point of return, recognition, and support for the different elements of being that had to continue beyond death. To preserve the body was not to cling blindly to lifeless matter. It was to preserve the ground on which identity might still stand. The mummy was therefore not a relic of denial. It was a practical and sacred answer to the problem of how a person could remain whole when death seemed determined to divide and scatter everything. And yet the Egyptians knew preservation alone was not enough. A body could be dried and wrapped, but if the name were lost, the offering ceased, the heart betrayed its owner, or the tomb were plundered, then eternity remained insecure. This is what gives Egyptian funerary belief its remarkable complexity. It never trusted a single solution. There was no one gesture that solved death. Instead, there was a system of layered protections. If the body needed preservation, the name needed inscription. If the dead needed nourishment, the living had to bring offerings. If danger lay in the next world, spells had to be written. If judgment awaited, the heart had to be protected. If tomb robbery threatened, the burial had to be hidden. If memory faded, images had to endure. The Egyptians built their afterlife like people reinforcing a house against every possible storm. They did not assume eternity would come easily. They prepared for it the way farmers prepare for drought, or sailors prepare for rough water, with redundancy, caution, and long habit. Perhaps that is why their burial customs can feel at once magnificent and deeply tender. The grandeur is obvious. The architecture, the gold, the royal tombs, the painted papyri, the masks, the shrines, the elaborate coffins and texts, all declare a civilization of immense symbolic imagination. But tenderness lies underneath that surface. One sees it in the floral garlands laid over a reburied body. One sees it in the tiny amulet placed within the wrappings where no eye would admire it, except perhaps the eyes of the gods. One sees it in the painstaking painted face of a mummy portrait, in the care taken to restore the mouth so the dead might speak again, in the food and beer left in chapels where the living return to sustain someone no longer visible among them. These are acts of tenderness disguised as ritual procedure. The Egyptians may have spoken in the language of cosmic order and divine judgment, but they were also speaking the language of grief. They were saying, in every way their culture allowed, that the dead should not go alone into the dark. The tomb, too, becomes more moving when seen in that light. It was never only a monument to status. Yes, it displayed rank. Yes, it preserved wealth and identity. Yes, it could proclaim social importance and family prestige. But it was also a home made for someone who could no longer build a home for themselves. It was a final architecture of care. Food was arranged there, words were carved there, Gods were painted there. Doors were made symbolic there. Boats and fields and servants and gardens were pictured there because the living could not bear to imagine the dead in emptiness. So they surrounded them with order. They built permanence out of stone because flesh would not remain permanent on its own. They painted abundance because hunger was too cruel a possibility. They gave the dead an afterlife in images before the afterlife could be reached in truth. There is something else the Egyptians understood that makes their burial rituals feel strangely modern despite their distance from us. They understood that memory is not passive. People do not remain present by accident. They remain present because the living continue to act. Names must be spoken, places must be maintained, stories must be told, offerings must be brought. Even today, in ways both grand and humble, we do something similar. We preserve photographs, we keep letters, we visit graves. We speak of the dead in the present tense for a while because it feels unbearable not to. We build memorials, save voicemails, wear jewelry that belonged to someone gone, cook their favorite meals, and tell stories that keep their face alive in the minds of people who never met them. The Egyptians did all of this through a different religious language, but the instinct beneath it is the same. They feared that the worst part of death might not be dying, but being erased. And that may be why their culture invested so heavily in names. To destroy a name was to wound the person. To preserve it was to give them another chance at continuation. A carved name on stone, a written name on a coffin, a repeated name in a funerary prayer. These were not casual labels. They were lifelines. In a world where the dead depended on remembrance, naming became a form of survival. Even now, when we study Egypt, one of the most moving things is the survival of individual names. Not merely a priest, not merely a woman, not merely a child, but a person called by a particular sound in a living language, buried by people who hoped that sound would not perish. The ancient Egyptian tomb speaks with many voices, but one of its oldest and simplest messages is this: remember who lies here. At the same time, the Egyptians did not treat memory as enough by itself. They were too realistic for that. Memory fades, families die out, tomb chapels fall into ruin, priests lose endowments, kingdoms collapse, robbers break through seals, sand shifts. Even the most faithful descendants cannot guarantee forever. So Egyptian burial reached for stronger materials than memory alone. It sought help from salt, resin, linen, stone, wood, gold, paint, papyrus, and the gods themselves. This is part of what makes the tradition so impressive. It refuses sentimentality. Love for the dead is not expressed only through feeling. It is expressed through engineering, craft, administration, and ritual repetition. The Egyptians organized grief. They gave it architecture. They made it durable. In doing so, they created a mortuary culture that was not only emotionally rich but materially effective enough to survive thousands of years. And still, despite all their efforts, they never entirely conquered the instability they feared. Tombs were robbed. Bodies were damaged. Dynasties changed. Ancient scripts became unreadable. Temples went silent. The old rituals ceased to be practiced. Yet the astonishing thing is not that the system eventually failed in some respects. The astonishing thing is how much of it survived. Bodies remained. Coffins endured. Tomb paintings retained their color. spells could be translated again. The names of kings, priests, daughters, mothers, and officials emerged back into the light. The Egyptians did not achieve eternity exactly as they imagined it, but they came closer than most civilizations ever have. Their dead were not forgotten. Their burial customs didn't vanish. Their great argument against oblivion still stands in museums, in archaeological sites, in books, in film, in scholarship, and in the collective imagination of the world. That survival, however, should not be mistaken for simple triumph. There is sadness in it too. Many mummies now rest far from their original tombs. Many funerary goods have been separated from the bodies they were meant to protect. Many names are lost forever. Many burials survive only as fragments. The modern world has preserved much, but it has also disrupted much. We inherit the Egyptian dead under strange conditions, seeing them through glass cases, scans, photographs, and reports, often unable to restore the original unity of body, place, object, and ritual that once gave them meaning. This makes our encounter with them both privileged and incomplete. We know more than many generations before us, yet we also meet the dead after a long history of damage, dispersal, and reinterpretation. To study a mummy is therefore to stand inside both preservation and loss at once. Perhaps this is why Egyptian burial rituals continue to fascinate people so deeply. They do not offer a neat victory over death. They offer something more believable and more human, an immense, patient struggle against it. The Egyptians didn't deny mortality. They looked at it directly. They watched bodies decay. They knew tombs could be violated. They knew memory could fail. They knew the next world might be dangerous and judgment real. But instead of surrendering to all that, they answered it with every tool they had. They answered with art. They answered with religion. They answered with chemistry. They answered with words. They answered with architecture. They answered with love. That is what makes their burial rituals feel so large. They gathered an entire civilization around the problem of how to care for the dead properly, and then they kept refining that answer for more than 3,000 years. And so, after thousands of years of tombs and prayers, of embalming workshops and desert graves, of priests in leopard skins and mourners with dust in their hair, of coffins painted with eyes and papyri filled with spells, the story of mummification and burial rituals in ancient Egypt comes at last to its deepest ending. Not the ending the Egyptians feared, which was oblivion, silence, erasure, and the breaking apart of all that made a person whole. But another kind of ending, quieter and more profound. The realization that everything they built around death was also, in its own way, a statement about life. The Egyptians preserved the body because life had been precious. They wrote the name because a life without remembrance seemed unbearable. They fed the dead because life had once meant hunger, satisfaction, warmth, family, labor, and joy. They painted gardens and boats and fields because life had been lived under the sun, beside water, among growing things. They imagined paradise not as a void of pure spirit, but as a perfected continuation of what they already loved. In trying to defeat death, they revealed what they believed life was for. That may be the final secret, hidden within all the linen and stone. Ancient Egyptian burial customs were never merely fascinated with death itself. They were fascinated with what death threatened to steal: a voice, a face, a name, a body recognized by others, a place in the order of things, a seat at the table, a pair of hands that had once worked, held, built, and touched. The Egyptians looked at death and saw not only cessation, but theft. And because they understood it that way, they answered with restoration. They restored the face through masks and portraits. They restored the body through embalming. They restored the mouth through ritual. They restored the name through inscription. They restored provision through offerings. They restored orientation through spells. They restored dignity through tomb architecture. They restored continuity by refusing to let the dead become formless. All of Egyptian funerary culture can be understood as one immense labor of restoration against the injuries of mortality. This is why the mummy remains such a powerful symbol even now. It is not simply a preserved corpse. It is a declaration. It says that a human body is worth saving. It says that death should not be allowed to reduce a person to anonymity and dust without protest. It says that memory can take material form. It says that grief can become craft. It says that belief can become chemistry, architecture, and art. The mummy is frightening to some people because it confronts them with mortality in visible form. But the deeper truth is that the mummy was never meant to be an emblem of horror. It was meant to be a success. It was meant to be a body defended, a person still intact enough to cross into another mode of existence. The dry skin, the folded hands, the wrappings, the hidden amulets, the sealed coffin, all of it was meant to say that the dead person had not been abandoned. And perhaps that is why the Egyptian world devoted so much beauty to burial. Beauty was not incidental, it was protective. A golden mask did not merely display wealth, it transfigured the face. Fine linen did not merely cover the corpse, it dignified it. Painted walls did not merely decorate stone, they filled eternity with scenes of abundance and calm. Scented oils and resins did not merely preserve tissue, they sanctified the body. Music, lament, garlands, and processions did not merely accompany death, they carried it across the threshold in a form that could be borne by the living. Beauty, in Egypt, was one way of refusing the ugliness of decay and loss. It was one way of insisting that the dead still belonged to order, not chaos. Yet the most extraordinary thing of all may be that this great labor did not belong only to kings. Pharaohs had the grandest tombs, certainly. Their burials gathered the full force of state resources, priestly power, and theological complexity. But over time, the hope of survival after death widened. Coffin texts spread beyond royal circles. Funerary papyri, amulets, painted coffins, and mummification itself became available in different forms to wider parts of society. Rich and poor still lived very different lives and received very different burials, but the same longing appears across those differences. A child wrapped carefully and laid to rest. A local official buried with offerings and texts. A woman remembered by name. A priest reburied with floral care after tomb robbery. A Roman period mummy given a painted portrait so the face would not vanish. Across all these burials runs the same human instinct. Let this person continue. Let them not be lost. When viewed across 3 millennia, that instinct becomes even more remarkable. Egypt changed repeatedly. Kingdoms fragmented and reformed. New rulers came from abroad. Artistic styles shifted. Languages overlapped, temples rose and later fell silent. Methods of embalming evolved. Tomb architecture changed. Yet the burial tradition remained recognizable because the emotional core remained recognizable. Bodies still mattered. Names still mattered. Ritual still mattered. The dead still required care. It is difficult to think of another civilization that sustained such a continuous and elaborate commitment to the afterlife for so long. But perhaps what made it possible was not merely religious rigidity, it was emotional necessity. Egyptians kept these rituals alive because they still answered a need no political upheaval could erase. People kept dying. The living kept grieving. The fear of forgetting never became irrelevant. And then, in time, the old religion faded. Christian burial practices spread. Mummification ceased. Hieroglyphs fell silent. The temples that had once supplied sacred words for the dead no longer anchored daily life. The great funerary system, so carefully tended for centuries, was no longer renewed from within. And still, somehow, it endured. The mummies remained. The coffins remained. The tomb walls remained. The names remained often enough to be read again. That survival is almost eerie in its success. The Egyptians wanted to endure. They wanted their dead to remain visible, nameable, preserved, and difficult to erase. Against extraordinary odds, many of them did. Not in exactly the form they expected, perhaps. Not in the field of reeds as they imagined it, at least not in any way history can prove. But, in another sense, they succeeded magnificently. Their dead were not forgotten. Their fear of oblivion was answered, if imperfectly, by survival into human memory on a scale few other ancient peoples ever achieved. Still, there is humility in this final chapter. Egypt did not conquer death completely. No one has. Tombs were robbed. Bodies were damaged. Families vanished. Countless names are gone forever. We know the great kings far more often than the ordinary mourners who loved them, and far more than the anonymous dead buried without monuments. The preservation of some require the loss of much else. And even the mummies that remain come to us torn from their original worlds, seen through glass, studied by machines, translated by scholars, admired by strangers. Something has been saved, but something has also been lost that can never be fully restored. The warm, living network of prayers, visits, offerings, and remembered voices that once surrounded these dead can only be imagined now. What survives is powerful, but it is partial. Perhaps that is why the ancient Egyptian response to death still feels so moving. It is not because they solved mortality better than anyone else. It is because they understood, with unusual clarity, how much of a person is at risk when death comes. They understood that to lose the body, the name, the face, the place of memory, and the continuity of care was to suffer many deaths at once. So they fought on every front. They fought decay with natron. They fought forgetting with inscription. They fought hunger with offerings. They fought silence with spells. They fought darkness with solar rebirth. They fought danger with amulets. They fought isolation with tomb chapels. They fought violation with secrecy and reburial. They fought moral uncertainty with judgment and the hope of justification. They fought, in other words, with everything they had. That totality is what gives their funerary culture its grandeur. It was not half-hearted. It was a civilization, meeting death with full effort. And maybe that is why, Even in a modern world so different from theirs, we are still drawn to their tombs. We recognize something of ourselves there. We may not preserve bodies in linen or write protective spells on papyrus, but we still leave flowers. We still preserve photographs. We still speak names at gravesides. We still keep objects that once belonged to those we miss. We still arrange funerals, not only to dispose of a body, but to honor a life. We still fear the blankness of forgetting. We still hope, in one form or another, that love might reach beyond the grave. The Egyptians made that hope visible with unmatched intensity. They turned it into one of the most elaborate mortuary cultures in history. But its emotional root is not foreign. It is one of the oldest human impulses there is. To care for the dead as if care might still matter. It is the return of the story to the place it began, with a body laid into the earth and the living refusing to walk away empty-handed. From the earliest desert burials to the most elaborate royal mummies, from the first accidental preservations in sand to the painted faces of Roman Egypt, the same gesture repeats. Prepare the dead, protect them, give them what they need, remember them, make a place for them, keep them whole as long as possible. That repetition, sustained over thousands of years, becomes more than ritual. It becomes a philosophy of love under the pressure of mortality. They were not merely customs of disposal. They were acts of loyalty, acts of fear, acts of devotion, acts of craftsmanship, acts of hope. Above all, they were acts of defiance against the idea that a human life should end in unprotected disappearance. The Egyptians could not prevent death, but they could answer it. They could answer it with tombs aligned to the horizon, with coffins painted in color, with resin-scented linen, with names cut into stone, with prayers rising into still air, with priests calling the dead back to speech, with families leaving bread and beer in chapels, with hidden caches that rescued broken eternity and tried once more to make it safe. They answered death by saying again and again that the person mattered too much to be surrendered without a fight. That is the end of the story. Not a simple ending, not a triumphant ending without sorrow, but a human one. The ancient Egyptians looked into the great silence that waits for every life and answered with preservation, ritual, and memory. Their tombs have been opened, their dead have been studied, their kingdoms have fallen, but the force of that answer still reaches us. It reaches us every time we see the quiet curve of a wrapped hand, the painted calm of a coffin face, the careful line of hieroglyphs preserving a name against time. It reaches us because beneath all the grandeur lies a truth that has never aged. To love the dead is to fight for their place in the world, even after they are gone. And few people in history fought for that place as passionately, as beautifully, or as enduringly as the ancient Egyptians. And now, as the last torchlight fades from the tomb, and the ancient sands grow still once more, we leave behind a world that spent thousands of years preparing for what came after death. A world of linen and incense, of sacred words whispered in darkness, of golden masks, silent chambers, and names carved carefully against the passage of time. And as this long journey through mummification and burial rituals comes to an end, perhaps what lingers most is not only the mystery of ancient Egypt, but the quiet human longing at the heart of it all. The longing to be remembered, to be protected, and not to vanish entirely. So tonight, As you drift towards sleep, let the desert fall silent around you. Let the tomb doors close gently. Let the prayers fade into the distance. And let the ancient dead rest once more beneath the sands, wrapped in the hope that memory might last longer than time. Thank you for spending this quiet journey with me. And until next time, may your rest be deep, your thoughts be soft, and your night be peaceful.